Tonight we begin with a development that Kremlin officials had feared, military commanders had dismissed, and Western intelligence agencies had quietly tracked for months. A rebellion that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shattered the myth of Russian military cohesion. 72 hours that exposed fractures running deeper than anyone publicly acknowledged. 72 hours that forced Moscow to confront a truth it had desperately tried to suppress. What Russian frontline units did this week crossed a line that the Kremlin had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukrainian forces did not hesitate. They responded with precision, coordination, and devastating effectiveness. This is not speculation. This is not propaganda. This is happening right now, confirmed by multiple eyewitness accounts, intercepted communications, and satellite imagery that paints a picture of an army beginning to fracture from within. The soldiers refusing orders aren't conscripts fresh from training camps. They aren't untested reserves pulled from distant regions. These are battle-hardened units, men who have survived months of grinding warfare, now telling their commanders they will no longer advance into what they call certain death. And tonight, we have obtained exclusive testimony from those who witnessed these refusals firsthand. For several months now, there had been signals, not from official channels, not from formal military communications, just signals, that Russian units along the Eastern Front were preparing something unprecedented. The Russian military has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in NATO intelligence circles this week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian troop movements know the indicators: the repositioning of supply convoys, the rotation of command personnel, the sudden increases in encrypted communications traffic, the predictable patterns of artillery bombardment. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russian forces go quiet, it means something is about to get loud. But this time, the silence meant something different entirely. It wasn't the silence before an offensive, it was the silence of paralysis, the silence of units that had stopped moving forward because the men inside them had decided they would go no further. The first reports emerged from Bakhmut's northern approaches, where a battalion reportedly refused direct orders to assault fortified Ukrainian positions. Within 48 hours, similar reports surfaced from Avdiivka, then from positions near Kremlin, then from units stationed along the Zaporizhia line. What had been isolated incidents of individual soldiers refusing orders had transformed into something far more organized, far more widespread, and far more dangerous to Moscow's war effort. Early Tuesday morning, Ukrainian intelligence detected what they described as unusual command and control disruptions across multiple Russian sectors, including emergency communications protocols that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of emergency measures that Russian command structures only deploy when they are signaling something very specific: imminent collapse, loss of unit cohesion, or battlefield mutiny. Ukrainian commanders didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russian forces were changing their operational posture. And when an invading army shifts posture without explanation, even by small margins, the defending force pays attention. The breakthrough came Wednesday afternoon when Ukrainian electronic warfare units intercepted a series of communications between a Russian battalion commander and his superiors in the rear. The conversation, portions of which have been verified by 3 independent sources, revealed a commander pleading with headquarters for permission to withdraw his men. "They will not move forward," the commander reportedly stated. "I cannot make them move forward. They have seen what happens to the units ahead of us. They know they are being sent to die for nothing." The response from command was chilling in its detachment. You will advance at 0600 or you will be replaced. But replacement, as frontline soldiers have learned, often means something far more permanent than reassignment. The intelligence assessment issued by Ukrainian military command tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Briefing after briefing described Russian unit cohesion as deteriorating, increasingly unstable, and perhaps most importantly, approaching critical thresholds not seen since the chaotic early weeks of the invasion. But Russian intimidation tactics only work if the target hesitates. Ukrainian forces did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated offensive actions we've seen in the past 6 months. Here's what we know. Within 12 hours of detecting the command disruptions, Ukraine launched targeted strikes against Russian positions showing signs of disorganization. These weren't the standard harassment attacks designed to keep pressure on defensive lines. These were precision assaults on command posts and logistics nodes, the kinds of strikes that Ukrainian forces only execute when they are preparing to exploit a significant enemy weakness. The timing was surgical. The execution was flawless. And the results are still being tallied as casualties mount on the Russian side. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched coordinated operations across 3 separate sectors, including a Russian forward command post that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a planned offensive that will now never materialize. Ukrainian forces struck before Russian command could restore order. They hit the command post directly, eliminating key officers attempting to rally their reluctant troops. They hit ammunition depots that were stockpiled for the aborted offensive. They hit vehicle staging areas where armored units were likely preparing to support the advance that soldiers had refused to make. In other words, Ukraine targeted not just Russian positions, but Russian intentions, the infrastructure that would have made the offensive operational. This is what made Ukrainian intelligence's assessment so urgent. Russia's planned operation wasn't just theoretical, it was imminent. It represented the kind of coordinated push that could have broken through defensive lines if left unchallenged. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike random targets hoping for lucky hits. They didn't waste precious munitions on secondary objectives. They hit the command structure coordinating the offensive. They hit the logistics chain that would have sustained it. They hit the communication nodes that Russian commanders desperately needed to restore discipline. And then they did something even more devastating. They broadcast intercepted communications to Russian units still in the field, letting soldiers know that their commanders were willing to sacrifice them for objectives that military analysts have called strategically meaningless. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Russia's planned offensive was designed to test the resilience of Ukrainian defensive lines after months of grinding attritional warfare. Moscow wanted to see whether Ukraine would buckle under renewed pressure, but instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't retreat into defensive positions. They launched a counteroffensive so swift, so precisely targeted, that even Russian military leadership noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but today, Ukraine did. Military analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's operational pause as a strategic recalculation, a way to reassess capabilities before committing to new offensives. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both vigilant and capable of devastating counterpunches. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse valuable assets before impact. That timing matters because it shows a level of battlefield intelligence that Moscow did not anticipate. It shows that Ukraine is not simply defending territory, they are actively hunting Russian vulnerabilities and exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. The eyewitness accounts we've obtained paint a picture of chaos on the Russian side. One account from a medic who treated wounded soldiers from a unit that had refused orders describes men who were more afraid of their own commanders than of Ukrainian artillery. They told me they had watched 3 units ahead of them get annihilated, the medic recounted. Complete destruction. And for what? For positions they couldn't hold anyway. They decided they would rather face punishment than face certain death. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukrainian response. Artillery units carried out sustained bombardment of Russian rear positions, forcing evacuation of at least 2 major logistics hubs. Drone squadrons targeted Russian armored vehicles that had been positioned forward in the last 72 hours. Special operations forces operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed fuel depots used by mechanized units preparing to spearhead the now abandoned offensive. This wasn't just tactical harassment. This wasn't just opportunistic targeting. This was systematic dismantling of Russian offensive capability. This was strategic decapitation of an operation before it could launch. And strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed drive on Kiev in the war's opening months. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russian logistics, degrades Russian morale, or exposes Russian command failures. The rebellion spreading through Russian units represents something Moscow cannot solve with artillery or airstrikes. You cannot bomb your own soldiers into compliance. You cannot threaten men into advancing when they have decided that the threat of punishment is preferable to the certainty of death. Remember, Russia thought their overwhelming firepower would break Ukrainian resistance within weeks. They thought Western support would falter as the conflict dragged on. They thought their own soldiers would fight with the same fanatical determination as their propaganda suggested. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukrainian resistance has only strengthened with time. Western support, despite political turbulence, continues flowing into Ukrainian hands, and Russian soldiers, the very men Moscow depends upon to prosecute this war, are beginning to question whether the objectives justify the sacrifice. This is not unprecedented in Russian military history. The seeds of revolution have often been planted in the trenches among soldiers who came to believe their commanders had abandoned them. The Tsarist army's collapse in World War I began with similar refusals, similar quiet mutinies that spread from unit to unit until the entire structure crumbled. No one is suggesting that Russia faces imminent revolution, but the parallels are impossible to ignore for anyone who has studied how armies fracture under prolonged stress. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest operational failures happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense domestic pressure. Military hardliners want escalation, including potential tactical nuclear deployment. Pragmatists want negotiated settlement before losses become catastrophic. Economic elites want sanctions relief that only peace can deliver. And the general population wants to know when their sons and husbands will come home. Putin is balancing these demands while prosecuting a war that has gone nothing like planned. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The eyewitness accounts we've gathered suggest that Russian soldiers understand this better than anyone. One account from a sergeant who spoke to journalists through encrypted channels describes a conversation with his commanding officer. "He told us we were fighting for Russia's survival," the sergeant recounted. "But we looked around and saw expensive equipment destroyed, friends killed, and positions that changed hands 5 times in a month. We asked him, survival of what? For whom? He had no answer." That question, survival of what? For whom? Is spreading through Russian ranks like a virus that no amount of propaganda can cure. NATO's intelligence assessment, now circulating among member nations, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow this moment of Russian weakness to pass unexploited. Alliance officials said plainly that Russia's operational pause was inconsistent with the confident military posture Moscow has projected publicly. That is diplomatic language for they're in serious trouble and they know it. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO intelligence unless something serious is at stake. The assessment reportedly recommends accelerated weapons deliveries to Ukraine, particularly systems that can exploit Russian disorganization before Moscow has time to restore discipline. Time is the critical variable. Russian command has dealt with isolated refusals before, usually through a combination of threats, punishments, and sometimes summary executions. But those methods require time to implement, and Ukraine is not giving them that time. Every hour that passes without Russian units advancing is an hour Ukraine uses to strengthen positions, gather intelligence, and prepare the next round of precision strikes. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured, confident speech tonight. He said, "Our enemy is learning what we have known from the beginning, that no amount of force can compel a free people to submit." He said, "The soldiers refusing to advance against our positions are not cowards. They are men who have realized they are fighting for lies." And he said, "We do not celebrate their suffering, but we will not hesitate to defend our land against anyone who threatens it, regardless of whether they advance willingly or under compulsion." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's restraint is notable. He could have mocked Russian military failures. He could have proclaimed imminent victory. Instead, he spoke with the sober recognition that this war is far from over, even as momentum shifts in Ukraine's favor. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning for Moscow. Russia's frontline rebellion wasn't isolated to a single sector. Along with the initial refusals near Bakhmut, units near Avdiivka also reported refusing direct assault orders, citing unsustainable casualty rates. Wagner Group remnants integrated into regular army units have clashed with commanding officers over tactical decisions. Russian military bloggers have increased criticism of command incompetence, targeting generals by name. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russian military discipline fractures across multiple sectors simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. The eyewitness accounts we've obtained describe a phenomenon that military historians will study for generations. The moment when an army's willingness to fight evaporates not through defeat, but through the accumulated weight of senseless sacrifice. We buried 17 men last week, one account describes. 17. For a tree line that we lost again 3 days later. You can order men to die, but you cannot order them to believe their deaths matter. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a strategic withdrawal to consolidate defensive positions while rebuilding unit cohesion. Another is that Russia is attempting to rotate exhausted units with fresh reserves, though where those reserves might come from remains unclear. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create conditions for escalation, potentially including weapon systems that have so far remained unused in this conflict. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Russian forces to reconsolidate. They didn't give Moscow time to spin the narrative. They didn't allow the Kremlin to frame retreat as strategic repositioning. They struck with devastating precision while Russian forces were still reeling. The message was unmistakable. Hesitation has consequences. Weakness will be exploited. And Ukraine is watching every movement, ready to capitalize on any opportunity Moscow provides. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine's offensive capability can be sustained through the coming months. Ukraine wants to show that Russian military power is not invincible, that cracks in the facade can become fractures and fractures can become collapse. NATO wants to prevent escalation while ensuring Ukraine maintains battlefield advantage. And the international community wants to prevent this regional conflict from expanding into something far more catastrophic. The soldiers refusing orders on the Russian side have become unwitting actors in this larger drama. Their individual decisions, to advance or refuse, to obey or rebel, carry weight far beyond their immediate circumstances. Every unit that refuses is a unit that must be dealt with before offensives can resume. Every commander who cannot control his men is a commander who may soon be replaced. Every replacement takes time, disrupts operations, and creates opportunities for Ukrainian forces to exploit. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command communications with heightened attention. They say encrypted traffic has increased dramatically as Moscow attempts to assess the scope of the rebellion. They say punishment units have been deployed to several sectors where refusals were reported, suggesting the Kremlin is responding with coercion rather than addressing underlying grievances. And they say Russia's decision to launch the now-aborted offensive was likely part of a broader strategy intended to demonstrate continued offensive capability before potential peace negotiations. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is pressing their advantage with remarkable aggression. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and devastating, and sent a message to Moscow that Russian weakness will not go unexploited. And it sent a message to NATO allies that Western weapons are being used effectively, that Ukrainian forces know how to capitalize on opportunities, and that continued support is producing measurable results. The eyewitness accounts we've obtained will likely multiply in coming days as more soldiers find ways to share their experiences. Each account adds detail to a picture that Moscow desperately wants to suppress, an army losing faith in its mission, its commanders, and perhaps perhaps its government. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russian command hoped to achieve with their planned offensive. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented a potentially dangerous Russian advance before it could launch. It demonstrated that Ukrainian intelligence remains capable of anticipating Russian movements. And it showed Russian soldiers, those still willing to fight and those who have decided they will not, that their commanders' plans can be shattered before they even begin. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the next several days. If they attempt to restore discipline through punishment alone, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a deeper crisis. If they attempt to launch new offensives without addressing the underlying morale collapse, Ukrainian forces have already shown they are prepared, capable, and eager to respond. They have shown they are ready to strike. They have shown they are watching. And they have shown that Russian military power, once considered overwhelming, can be challenged, degraded, and perhaps ultimately defeated. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Russian military appears to be hesitating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Moscow is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight, Russian leadership learned something they have learned many times but continue to ignore: that soldiers cannot be forced to fight indefinitely for objectives they do not believe in. That military power means nothing if the men wielding it have lost faith in their commanders, and that Ukraine, battered, bloodied, but unbowed, remains capable of exploiting every weakness, every hesitation, every fracture in the invading force. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear. The rebellion spreading through Russian ranks is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of deeper rot. Ukrainian forces have demonstrated they can capitalize on Russian weakness with devastating effectiveness, and the coming days will determine whether this moment marks a turning point in a war that has already exceeded anyone's expectations. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. This has been an in-depth analysis of the Frontline rebellion spreading through Russian forces and Ukraine's devastating response. The situation remains fluid, with new developments emerging hourly. Stay tuned for continued coverage as this critical moment in the conflict continues to develop.